Hi, everyone. I'm Bob Jenrick. I am the pastor of Grace Redeemer Community Church, and here is my devotional thought for the day. I got this reading a recent article about a lost king by the name of Richard III. Did you know that most English royals receive an elaborate funeral procession and burial at some ancient English church? 30 English kings and queens have been buried at Westminster Abbey. King Edward the Confessor was the first to be buried there all the way back in 1066. Elizabeth I and James VI are also there. St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle is the resting place of 10 English kings or queens, including Henry III, George III, Elizabeth II, all buried there. But did you know that Richard III was a rare exception to a king who had an elaborate burial in a lavish cathedral? Richard III was King of England from 1483 until he died at the Battle of Bosworth Field on August 22nd, 1485. And after the battle, survivors brought his body to a nearby Franciscan monastery in Leicester, and they buried his body there. But in 1538, the building was demolished, and they didn't mark the grave. And after centuries of new construction, building on top of old buildings, etc., the location of Richard III's grave disappeared from history. And this had been a subject of much theorizing. And in 1975, the location of Richard's body all of a sudden became big news. This researcher by the name of Audrey Strange published an article theorizing that Richard III's body could be buried under the Leicester City Council parking lot. And in 2012, a team of researchers at the university began digging, and after just 6 hours, they found the king's remains. And he was crammed into a box that didn't even fit him. The coffin didn't even contain a shroud. So it was testing that proved that the body belonged to Richard III. And in 2015, after 430 years, Richard III finally received a proper king's burial at Leicester Cathedral. I used to have pretty strong convictions about burial as opposed to cremation. I wanted a shady grave site with a marble tomb or stone reporting all my highlights of my life to visitors and other passersby. I never wanted my grave to be forgotten or to be cremated and then put into an urn. But times have changed, though, haven't they? Families used to live in the same town for generations. Children would bring their children and their grandchildren to the grave, and they would tell stories and keep memories alive. But in the 21st century, families scatter all over the globe for college, for jobs, or other adventures. My brothers and I, we lived in the same town for the first 30 years of our lives, but now we're spread all over the country, and our kids will probably disperse as well. So why be buried if there's no one to visit you? Now, I understand why people have strong convictions about burial. Cremating a body seems so heartless, so permanent, and I used to feel that way. But now it doesn't matter to me very much what happens to my body. I don't feel very strongly about burial anymore because what really matters is not what happens to my body when I die, but what happens to my soul. And so Jesus promises that all who believe in him for salvation go immediately into his presence when we die. We only need to trust that Jesus paid the price for our sins on the cross and then rose from the dead. And because Jesus rose from the dead, because God raised him, God will raise us one day again too. And the Bible promises that one day all believers will receive a new, imperishable body that won't have these limitations that our earthly bodies have. 1 Corinthians 15:52 and 53 says, "The dead will be raised imperishable, for this perishable must put on imperishable, and this mortal must put on immortality." And boy, how I long for that day. Now, I don't know if Richard III was a believer. If he was, he doesn't care now that his body was buried under a parking lot. He's been rejoicing with the Lord for over 500 years. And if he wasn't a believer, then he's been eternally separated from God for over 500 years. And whether his body is buried under a parking lot or in Leicester Cathedral really doesn't matter. Most of us arrange for where our bodies will go when we die, but have we done so with our souls? Be sure you've got it settled with God where you will go after your death, and then it won't matter to you whether you were buried or whether you were cremated. None of that will matter to you. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Richard III, cremation versus burial, or to answer any questions you may have. Be blessed and have a great day, brothers and sisters.